What's up, fam? It's me. I'm back, feeling a whole lot better. And I just wanted to come to y'all because I promised y'all history lesson number 2, and we're gonna get into history lesson number 2 this early morning because it is 1:05 a.m. over here on the East Coast. And I couldn't think of a more perfect time to do history lesson number 2 than the day of the election, November the 3rd, because it is 1:05 a.m. November the 3rd, 2020. So I could not think of a better time to do history lesson number 2. And now, if you'll remember, and for those of you who don't know, who may be new to the channel or don't know about it, we just did history lesson number 1, where we talked about the Black Untouchables in India, and we connected it to Kamala Harris because Kamala Harris is from India. Kamala Harris is a member of that upper caste. Kamala Harris is a Hindu. Kamala Harris is what they call the upper in India. They call the upper class Brahmin. I think it's BRAH. I think it's either MIN or MAN. Brahmin. And that is what Kamala Harris is. So Kamala Harris comes from that culture of anti-Black racism. She comes from that belief system. She was raised in that belief system. She was raised to automatically think that she's better than Black folks, to automatically think that Black folks are just supposed to fall at her feet no matter how she treats them and what she does to them. That's just the culture the woman was raised in. And like I said, once she came here to the United States and she got a little position and she got a little power, she perpetuated that. She perpetuated that in her treatment of Black folks, and she used the law to do it. So that was history lesson number 1. If I think about it, if I remember, I'll put it up in the card somewhere. If not, history lesson number 1 will be linked in the description box along with some of the other stuff that we'll have linked there for tonight's video. But I want to get on into this. I hope everybody's doing well. I hope everybody's staying safe. I hope everybody's being smart. I hope everybody is making wise decisions when it comes to this voting. I hope you're not paying attention to mainstream media and not being fooled and not being tricked by what some mainstream media may be telling you as far as the polls are concerned. I'm not going to try to forecast or predict who I think is going to win or not win, because at this point, it doesn't really matter who wins, whether it's Trump or whether it's Joe Biden. It doesn't really matter who wins for Black folks, because not a whole lot is going to change for us. Now, Biden and Harris will make things, I think, my personal opinion, based on their history, just based on their records, just based on their records of dealing with Black folks, and based on how they have already made it clear throughout their individual campaigns when both of them were running for president, and the little bit of campaigning that they have done since they joined forces. Just based on this, and they say that the past is the best indicator of the future. So, I mean, just based on that, Biden-Harris White House would not be good for Black folks. It would not be good for us at all. It would not be good for FBA at all. At all. It would be very, very detrimental to us. Trump, and for 2 reasons. One, because some Black folks will get it in their head if Biden and Harris win that somehow we have won something as foundational Black Americans, and that'll be enough for them to get comfortable and complacent enough to go back to sleep, and we'll lose a lot of our momentum, right? And then 2, I mean, look at that. Look at their record. Look at both records of racism. Look at both records of anti-Black racism and their complete disdain for Black folk. They don't care anything about the Black community. They've made it clear that they don't care anything about the Black community. Kamala Harris just point blank told us that she was not going to do anything specific for the Black community. No. Joe Biden has not promised to do anything specific for us. Yeah, he put out that plan, but we've already gone over that plan. And you know how they do with the trick words and how they do it with the bait and switch. They'll start off black this, black that, African American this, African American that. But then when they get into the guts of these plans, then they start switching up to all this minority this and minority businesses and people of color and all of that. So they've already made it clear who they intend to do anything for. Joe Biden has already said day one, he will go about the business of making this 11 million illegal aliens citizens. And then, you know, they talk about all that they intend to do for the LGBT community. But so, you know, just based on that, yeah, a Biden-Harris White House would be detrimental, very detrimental to foundational Black Americans. Because as Tariq has said over and over and over again, when we're dealing with Donald Trump, we're just dealing with hardcore, open body, everyday racism, everyday white supremacy. That's what we're used to dealing with. That's what we've dealt with for 500 years in this country. We know it. You understand what I'm saying? We know how to, we know it when we see it. We know how to recognize it. We've even learned certain techniques on how to fight it. But you mess around and you get Biden and Harris, then not only do you have to deal with white supremacy, then you have to deal with all of these other groups, all of these other folks like the Latinos, the Hispanics, the Middle Easterners, the Asians, the Black immigrants. You have to deal with all these folks that want to practice white supremacy. You understand what I'm saying? All of these white supremacists and all these other different color faces, then we got to deal with them too. So, I mean, we got racism coming at us from all different directions, from all different groups. That's what happens with Biden and Harris, okay? So, yeah, we kind of lose either way, but I feel like we probably would lose even more fooling with Biden and Kamala Harris. I mean, they just, no, that's a no for me. As Randy Jackson used to say on what was it? I can't remember what it was, but no, dog, that's a no for me. Okay, so let's go ahead on and get into what we're gonna be talking tonight, so we can get into this history lesson number 2. And as you can see by the title of the video, the history lesson is the history of the Black vote in America. That's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the history of the Black vote in America. And we're going to break down the Black vote in America, the history of it, where it started, when it stopped, when it started back, the whole 9 yards. Okay? But first, let's go to this article in Bloomberg. And let's see what these here folks talking about. Okay. Let me maximize. You know, I like to maximize. This is coming from Bloomberg.com. Election 2020. Biden aides see warning signs in Black Latino turnout so far. Okay. So one thing is, again, mainstream media and all these Democratic publications and all these left-leaning publications are always trying to join this black and brown and trying to make it like it's some kind of black and brown coalition or like something is about Black folks and Latinos and all of this. No, this when you get more into this article, you'll realize that this doesn't have anything to do with the Latino vote. This is about the Black vote, period. Okay? But, you know, let's just read a little bit of it. We're not going to get into this whole article. It'll be in the description box. You can read the whole thing. But there's just certain things about this that I want to point out. It's by Tyler Pager, and it was done October 30th, 2020. And one of the bullet points is, despite record early turnout, Black Latino votes lag. Top Biden aides, confident seniors and suburban votes will carry. It says senior officials on Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden's campaign are increasingly worried about insufficient Black and Latino voter turnout in key states like Florida and Pennsylvania, with only 4 days into the election, according to people familiar with the matter. He can pretty much go ahead on and give up on Florida, because them Latinos out there already, I mean, Latinos largely will vote for Trump. Why? Because they identify as white. You understand what I'm saying? They identify with white supremacy. So they're going to lean more towards messing with Trump anyway. Despite record early vote turnout around the country, there are warning signs for Biden. In Arizona, 2/3 of Latino registered voters have not yet cast a ballot. In Florida, half of Latino and Black registered voters have not yet voted, but more than half of white voters have cast ballots, according to data from Catalyst, a Democratic data firm. In Pennsylvania, nearly 75% of registered Black voters have not yet voted, the data shows. Now, prior to this, mainstream media was trying to already claim Biden as the winner of the presidential election. And mainstream media has been lying for the last 4 or 5 months, trying to act like Biden had all of this Black support, all of this Black voter support, and all of that up until now. Now, because the new Black media, Jason, Tariq, Professor Black Truth, and others are breaking it down and just putting it out there and telling the truth, now mainstream media has to concede that, yeah, there are some problems. There are some worries. But that's not what I'm so concerned about. What I'm mostly concerned about is this right here. When you go down in the article a little bit, it says top campaign leaders have expressed confidence that Black and Latino voters will show up on election day. And historical trends suggest these groups often do prefer to vote in person. But some Biden advisors have expressed concerns about a lack of investment and are urging the campaign, so far unsuccessfully, to spend even more money to target these voters in the final stretch, especially given the campaign's record-shattering fundraising. Because, I mean, Biden has raised some money. Now, he has raised some money. I think he has outraised, as far as raising campaign money, I think he outraised Donald Trump. Biden's campaign disputed that these voter turnout efforts are being shortchanged. No campaign in American history has devoted this level of resources that we have to outreach to voters of color. That mostly means Black folks. And we're deeply proud of it, Simone Sanders, one of the campaign's most senior African-American advisors, said in a statement. In community-specific advertising alone, we've dedicated tens of millions of dollars to each community, with a total into 9 figures. And we've committed tens of millions on impersonal GOTV programs unique to communities of color. Again, Black folks. I mean, it's hard for these people to say the word Black. I mean, these people that like lightning is gonna come and strike them dead if they say the word Black. Earning the support of diverse voters is the beating heart of our operation. We're also the most diverse general election campaign in American history, including at senior levels. And all of our strategic decisions are driven by our diverse leadership teams. Now, that's Simone Sanders trying to give you this spin. Like they're working together, they're spending so much money, they're so diverse, everything is just working out so well. And, she's always trying to spin things for Biden. But this is what's really going on behind the scenes. And I want y'all to pay very close attention to when you hear some of this and see if it is reminiscent of some stuff that we heard maybe at the beginning of this year, end of last year, beginning of this year, about another campaign. Disagreements over how to allocate precious resources in the closing days are a common occurrence in a presidential campaign. But what has made these disputes, talking about the disputes in the Biden campaign, which have not been previously reported, more serious, is that the split has broken along racial lines. So even within the campaign now, you have these disagreements and these disputes causing a split among racial lines. But this is in this same diverse campaign that old girl Simone Sanders was just talking about. But now we're finding out that these disagreements about money and how to allocate these resources and all of this kind of stuff, these disputes which nobody has reported about before. Now, all of a sudden, this information is coming out that these disputes are actually splitting the campaign along racial lines. Okay? So even within his campaign, you have racial issues coming up. Okay? Some of those advocating for more spending, who are largely people of color, and say they feel that their communities are misunderstood by top Biden officials, sent multiple written proposals over the course of several months, including to National States Director Jen Ryder and her staff, outlining ways the campaign could bolster minority turnout. The people familiar with the effort said. They say the documents were ignored by campaign leadership. So basically, some of these so-called people of color in the campaign, black folks mainly, who advocate for more money being directed specifically towards campaigning to black communities or communities of color, say that their communities are being misunderstood by the top Biden officials. You understand what I'm saying? And they drew up written proposals of different ways that the campaign could bolster minority turnout. But these documents that they sent, and they sent these documents, several written proposals over a course of several months, all of them were ignored by campaign leadership. Why? Because again, the Democrats are just so convinced that we just owe them our vote, that they just own our vote. Remember, this is the same man that said that if you're not thinking about me, if you're even voting for me, if you're even thinking about voting for Trump or whatever, you're not black. So that's how comfortable black folks over the course of the last 50, almost 60 years, that's how comfortable we have made the Democrats. The Democrats are so comfortable, the Democrats so believe that they own our vote, that Biden's campaign leadership is ignoring any outlines or any plans or anything that other staff members, people of color, are turning in and are sending in that would help bring about a better turnout of those particular votes in those particular communities, because they're just so sure of our vote. They're just so sure. Well, no, we don't have to do any. We don't even have to. We don't even have to do anything special to campaign for them. You know what I'm saying? We definitely don't have to promise them anything. We definitely don't have to promise them any tangibles, anything like that. We definitely don't have to promise them anything for their vote. But we don't even have to spend any extra money or do anything extra to campaign to them. That's his mindset. That's the Democratic mindset towards black voters. The disagreements have resulted in heated conversations as staff argue over spending and strategy in the final stretch. And the advisors who say they are frustrated still say they're confident Biden will win the election, but they fear leaving anything to chance if the race is close. So they're still trying to spin it that, we kind of think, he might win, but they fear. So if you're saying that you fear leaving anything to chance, then what you're really saying is you're concerned that there's a very, very likely possibility that he won't win. Now, again, I want y'all to think about another campaign that ended at the end of last year, beginning of this year, and how there was talk of how there was all of these problems and all of these disagreements and all of this disconnect and all of that within the campaign itself and within the campaign's leadership and the staff, right? It goes on to say these advisors are pushing for more resources dedicated to getting out the vote, including paid door knocking, paid phone banking, and paid text messaging, according to people familiar with the dispute. As of October 14th, the Biden campaign and the Democratic National Committee had a combined $331 million cash on hand, according to their most recent reports with the Federal Election Commission. So these black folks, these so-called people of color in the campaign, these staffers want some of that money directed specifically towards doing specific things to engage voters in these communities of color. And the top officials, you understand what I'm saying? And the senior advisors and the campaign leadership are totally ignoring them. Totally ignoring them. Why? We don't need to do all of that to get these niggas to vote. These niggas owe us their vote. Why? Because we say so. We ain't got to do nothing for them. We don't have to promise them anything. We don't have to go overboard. We don't have to do anything special to engage them into voting for us. We don't have to do none of that. That's the mentality of the Democrats towards black voters. Okay? Now, both Biden and Trump campaigned in Florida on Thursday, with Biden holding drive-in rallies in Broward County and in Tampa. Trump also held a rally in Tampa, right? That's when it was down there in Florida, I believe, when they brought out that old line crooked Obama, and he was telling so many lies that he was just stammering all over his words, and he sounded like he was splaining and babbling and all of this kind. It was a mess. It was an absolute mess. Yet a Biden campaign staff member in Florida said coalition directors, those responsible for turning out the vote among specific demographic groups, have never been given a budget, despite repeated requests for funds they can allocate. The staffer said colleagues have spent their own money to put on voter engagement events, but the lack of coordination with senior leaders has stymied their efforts to do what the staff member called culturally competent outreach in critical parts of the state. Now, again, I want y'all to think about another campaign where we were hearing very, 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 very similar things that we didn't know about. It didn't all come out until this campaign came to an end, and it came out, you know, all the trouble that was going on inside the campaign, the disputes, the arguments, the disconnect with leadership, and all of that. I want y'all to think about that. Now, that's about all of this article that I'm going to read. Again, I just read this article because I want you to know, I want you to know how these Democrats, I want you to know their mindset. You understand what I'm saying? That at this point, at this critical juncture, they still won't do anything specific towards black voters. They already won't promise you any tangibles. They already won't offer you anything. They already won't sit at the table to even discuss anything specific for you. Kamala Harris has already told you she don't intend to do anything specifically for you. Joe Biden, in so many words, has told you that by already putting out what he intends to do day one. And that is take care of LGBT and illegal immigrants. But even beyond that, even when it comes to the campaign, even when it comes to campaigning, they won't do anything extra to interact with and engage black voters. But they still want you to vote for them. They're still expecting you to vote for them. Why? Because they say so. Now, Hold on. And I want to see which one of y'all remembers this. And it really doesn't make any difference where I get this from. Come on. It won't let me click on the link. It really doesn't make any difference where I get this from. I just want to remind y'all of where you've heard language very, 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 very similar to what we just heard that's going on behind the scenes in the Joe Biden campaign, where we've heard something very, very similar to that very recently, as a matter of fact. Okay. Do y'all remember when that young woman resigned from the Kamala Harris campaign and she wrote that scathing letter? Well, let's go over that letter again and let's just listen to some of the things that she was talking about. Okay, now I don't want this video to open. We're not trying to hear this video. All right, y'all. I'm waiting for it to finish loading. Yeah, we're going to get there. We're going to get to the history. Hold on. We're going to get to the history lesson now. Hold on. This is all getting us there. Okay. Remember, she wrote these words. This is my third presidential campaign, and I have never seen an organization treat its staff so poorly. Wrote State Operations Director Kelly Mallenbacher in the November 11 letter, which was obtained by the New York Times. So ain't it kind of coincidental that letter came out November 11, 2019, and then October 30th, 2020, we find out from the inside things that have never been previously reported about what's going on behind the scenes in the Biden campaign. She says, while I still believe that Senator Harris is the strongest candidate to win in the general election, I no longer have confidence in our campaign or its leadership. It is not acceptable to me that we encourage people to move from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore only to lay them off with no notice, with no plan for the campaign, and without thoughtful consideration of the personal consequences to them or the consequences that their absence would have on the remaining staff. It is unacceptable that we would lay off anyone that we hired only weeks earlier. It is unacceptable that with less than 90 days until Iowa, we still do not have a real plan to win. Well, it was something else that she said about the leadership. Our campaign for the people is made up of diverse talent. Now, what did we just hear Simone Sanders talking about all of this diversity within Biden's campaign? Our campaign for the people is made up of diverse talent, which is being squandered by indecision and a lack of leaders who will lead, she continued. So when you read that full letter, a whole lot of what she's saying about the leadership and about the campaign staffers not being able to get along and them not really having any plan and all of that, a lot of that sounds eerily similar to what we're hearing now is going on inside the Biden campaign. So I just wanted to bring that I just wanted to bring that out. I just wanted to bring that out. That's the main reason. Those are the two main reasons why I wanted to read this article from Bloomberg is one to let you see how determined the Democrats are that they're not going to offer us anything on any level. On any level. They're not going to engage us directly. I mean, foundational Black Americans, Black America, they're not going to engage us on any level. You understand what I'm saying? In this campaign, they're not going to engage Black voters one-on-one specifically on any level. On any level. There is nothing that they intend to do that's specifically aimed at and geared towards engaging Black voters. Nothing. Except for sit and just expect you to vote for them. Because they say so. Because somehow or another they feel like you owe them their vote. Like so many have said, they feel like they own the Black vote. And most of that is our fault because for, like I said, the last 50, almost 60 years, they've just been getting the Black vote without having to earn it. So we have spoiled them and corrupted them into believing that they own our vote. Well, that they own us along with our vote. That's the reason why people call it the Democratic plantation. And I wanted to bring out those similarities to what's now coming out about what's going on behind the scenes in the Biden campaign and compare it to what this staffer said was going on in those last weeks of the Harris campaign, right? Just falling apart, just completely and totally falling apart, okay? But now I want to go to one more story, and this is the story that's going to lead directly into the history of Black voting in America, right? Now, this comes from Slate.com, and this was October 31st, 2020, and this happened right here in my neck of the woods. Alamance County, that's down in the Burlington area and all of that. Not far from me. Alamance County is not far from me. Hold on a minute. I'm a little chilly, so I got to put my house coat on. Now, it says, this is what it says, North Carolina's police attack on election marchers has a long history behind it. And the mini caption is, a racist sheriff and a system of voter suppression meets in a cloud of pepper spray. Now, this was done by Julia Craven. And it has a picture of a Black man going in a voting poll. Early voting in Fayetteville, North Carolina on Thursday. Do you want to talk to me about something? Okay. All right. On Saturday, Alamance County Sheriff's deputies and city police pepper sprayed a crowd of about 200 people who were peacefully marching to the polls in Graham, North Carolina without warning and on slim reasoning. Graham police claimed that protesters didn't have the adequate permits to close off the road, while the Alamance County Sheriff's Office said that the march was shut down out of concerns for the safety of all. So just because they claim they didn't have these adequate permits, and just because the county sheriff's office is saying it was shut down because of safety concerns, that's reason enough for you to go out and pepper spray a crowd of 200 and some people. If it is at all difficult to understand how a police department could act so heinously, particularly when children and elderly community members are present within the crowd, then it's important for one to grasp the context that the law enforcement operates within. Well, it operates within the slave patrol. That's what it operates within. Law enforcement operates within the scope of white supremacy. That's all you need to really understand. This is the second time since 2016 that Alamance County has made national news for its treatment of voters. In 2017, 12 residents, most of whom were black and on parole or probation for felony charges, were charged for illegally voting in the 2016 election. If someone is convicted of a felony in North Carolina, they lose their right to vote for the entirety of their incarceration and until any parole or probation has concluded. Another key method of voter suppression in the state. Now, first of all, I do want to say this. If you're convicted of a felony and you incarcerated, how you going to vote? So that doesn't sound like voter suppression. The fact that an incarcerated person can't vote. You understand what I'm saying? What we need to be more concerned about is all these reasons why these folks are ended up being incarcerated. But quite naturally, if you've been charged with a crime, you've gone through the system, you've been found guilty, you understand what I'm saying, and then you end up with a prison sentence. Okay, well, quite naturally, you can't vote while you incarcerated, and I even kind of understand not being able to vote while you're on parole or probation is because you're still under the direct control of the Department of what is it? The Department of Corrections. Okay, but they say that that's another form of voter registration suppression here in this state. There is no doubt that in North Carolina's history, felony disenfranchisement legislation was enacted by legislators as a way to keep African Americans from voting and participating in democracy. Orville Vernon Burton, the Judge Matthew J. Perry Distinguished Professor of History at Clemson University, told WRAL in July. While it's up to the local district attorney to bring charges in these cases, police, particularly sheriffs, who wield an astounding amount of power within their jurisdiction, and they do, have a critical role in setting the tone for the prosecutions. Voter intimidation is an omnipresent concern in North Carolina, a state that has tried to prevent black and brown vote. See, there they go again with that black and brown. It's always black and brown. They can't never just say black folks. It's either got to be black and brown or people of color or minorities or whatever. They cannot just concentrate on the real victims of all of this oppression. Black folks. Voter intimidation is an omnipresent concern in North Carolina, a state that has tried to prevent black and brown voters from casting ballots with surgical precision since Reconstruction. During the late 1800s, a high-level white supremacist campaign in North Carolina went to extreme acts of violence. We're going to talk about this, including massacring black residents in Wilmington. We're going to talk about the Wilmington Massacre in just a little while. Okay? In order to regain political power within the state, less outwardly violent voter suppression tactics have cropped up in the state following the Supreme Court's weakening of the Voting Rights Act in Shelby versus Holder, such as North Carolina's infamous voter ID law and gerrymandering so precise that every district in the state had to be redrawn. Now, we went through that whole thing, that whole redistricting thing here in North Carolina. That was a big mess. Prior to the 1965 Voting Rights Act, black people across the South were at risk of being arrested by police on Election Day for minor crimes by officers hoping to deter voters from casting ballots. In recent years, there have been complaints about suspiciously timed arrests and traffic stops involving black residents on Election Day. Now listen to this. Alamance County Sheriff Terry Johnson, who has held the position for almost 18 years, has a record defined by racism and intimidation. As the 2004 general election approached, Johnson announced that he would send deputies to the homes of all new registrants with a Hispanic sounding name to investigate whether they were citizens. He claimed that undocumented people were registering to vote to local division of motor vehicle offices with falsified documents. The Justice Department sent election monitors to Alamance in 2004, 2008, and in 2012. So this Johnson dude is really off the hook. But now he's going into talking about the Latino community. I'm not talking about that right now. This summer, as citizens were demanding the removal of a Confederate statue in Graham, the sheriff's office announced that the city's police department would not be granting permits to protesters. When an activist asked Johnson why he and his deputies were breaking the law by foregoing North Carolina's mask mandate, he replied, "Ma'am, you're breaking the law. We know you're a member of Antifa." Now you got to remember, North Carolina is a Republican state. Ah, yes. North Carolina is a Republican state. But I read all of that to use this to enter into the history lesson. And two, to talk about these black folks out here getting beat up, pepper sprayed, taking their little children out there, and all of that. For what? Why are you out there marching and putting yourself at risk and getting beat up and pepper sprayed and all of this kind of stuff to go to a poll to vote? Who you voting for? What you voting for? Nobody on either side of the aisle has promised you anything. Nobody on either side of the aisle has guaranteed you anything. Nobody on either side of the aisle has made anything specific for you. You are not at the top of anybody's list. You are not on the top of anybody's agenda. So why are you out there putting yourself and your children at risk and being pepper sprayed, all hurt up, beat up, and all of that to go vote? Why? That's the question. Why? Why is any black person in 2020 putting themselves in harm's way in any kind of situation, putting yourself in harm's way to go vote? To go vote for two people, and they ain't one of two people, and ain't neither one of them promised you nothing. Ain't neither one of them done nothing for you. And the one that you've been loyal to for the last 50, 60 years certainly has done nothing for you. So why are you putting yourself in harm's way? Why are you putting your little innocent children in harm's way? Why are you teaching your children that it's okay for them to put themselves in harm's way for nothing? To get nothing out of it? Because that's what you're teaching them. You teaching them that it's all right for them to go out and march and protest and all of this kind of stuff, talking about voting and all of that, when they're not getting, when there's no expectation that you're going to get anything, because nobody has promised you anything. Nobody will even, the Biden campaign won't even spend money to directly engage with you. But you're putting yourself in harm's way. You're putting yourself and your children in harm's way. Why? Okay, which leads us to get into history lesson number 2. Now, in this article, they brought up the late 1800s, and they brought up the Wilmington Massacre, right? Well, we're going to go a little bit further than that. Yeah, we're going to touch on the Wilmington Massacre. We're going to talk about it and all that, but we're going to go back even further than that. We're going to go way back, okay? Now, hold on a minute. Let me make sure that I have Okay, now, the first thing that I want to do to lead us into this history lesson is I want to debunk this lie, um, this misrepresentation, whatever you want to call it, um, that many of us have fallen into. Because I fell into it and believed it for years, and it was not until my awakening and my eyes began to be open, my mind began to be open. I began to learn more and more about myself. I began to learn more and more about my people. I began to learn more and more about our history. It wasn't until then that I realized that it was a complete and total lie, probably a lie started by white folk from the dominant society, probably by the Democrats, to keep us on the Democratic plantation. But and it's a very to be honest, when you really break it down and really look at it, it's very disrespectful to our ancestors, to their struggle, to their fight, to reduce everything that they went through to voting. Because that's what they say. You understand what I'm saying? We have to honor our ancestors by voting. Our ancestors died for us to have the right to vote. And I think all black folks, especially all foundational black Americans, have heard that at some point or the others, that our ancestors died for us to have the right to vote. First of all, when you say it like that, what you kind of insinuate is that they made the choice to die while fighting for the right to vote. That's what, when you break it down, that's what you're really saying, is that they made a choice to die on the battlefield of the fight for the right to vote. When you say our ancestors died for us to have the right to vote, you're basically saying, they knew it was going to be a fight, but they were willing to die. They were willing to make that choice and put their lives on the line, like I said, and lose their lives on that battlefield that was the fight for the right to vote. It makes it seem like it was almost a choice. First of all, most of our ancestors didn't just die. There were very few of them that just died. Most of them were murdered, either directly or indirectly. Now, we have our ancestors coming to us here on this land in North America. We have our ancestors coming, from two different groups. We have the ancestors that were already here on this land as natives, because it has already been proven that Africans were coming back and forth into North America thousands of years before Columbus. And some of them were coming and staying and assimilating into the native culture and all of this, right? And then we have our ancestors that were brought here, that were kidnapped in Africa, brought here and enslaved. Okay, so let's talk about both of those groups of ancestors. Now, Tariq has taken us back. They want to start it. The official beginning of slavery is supposed to be 1619. Okay, but then we also know that because of the Gullah Geechee Wars, the Black Wars, what they call the Seminole Wars in Florida, that were going on around the 1540s, the 50 to the 1580s and all of that, right? But we can trace it even back further than that to 1526, when the Spanish brought the first black folks over here and enslaved them. The first black Africans over here and enslaved them. And they brought them in through South Carolina. It was right there at coast of Georgia and South Carolina and Georgia that they were brought in. And hold on a minute. Let me read you just a little touch of information about this 1526. Okay, I got a couple of stories on it, so I want to get the best one to read you. Okay, this is the one that I'm going to read, and it just gives you a little information. We're not going to go deep into that history, but just to know just a few facts about what took place in 1526. And this is an article that came from afropunk.com, September 12, 2019. And it says why 1526 is as deserving of commemoration as 1619. In 1526, African slaves and Native Americans combined to rid North America of slavery for the first time. That year, those same Africans became the first permanent settlers on the land later to be called the United States of America, nearly a century before Jamestown. In 1521, the wealthy Spanish sugar planter Lucas Vasquez de Alon from present-day Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic, sent Francisco Gordila and his cousin, the slave hunter Pedro de Cujo, to explore the American continent. They landed at a place thought to be the mouth of the PD River in South Carolina. Instead of exploring, Pedro captured 70 Native Americans for sale into slavery in Santo Domingo. Okay, now, they're here, down there around that South Carolina coast area. Instead of exploring, they come and they capture 70 natives and kidnap them into slavery to be sold in Santo Domingo, right? Now, these are Spanish. These people were Spanish. So let me ask you a question. Now, by this time, Cristobal Colon has been here. He has colonized South America. And, you know, folks know all about that. The Spanish know all about that. Everybody knows all about that because this man here is coming from one of the colonies that was set up by Cristobal Colon, right? So let me ask you this question. What color do you think these natives were that this man kidnapped? These 70 Native Americans that he captured and took back to take to slavery in Santo Domingo. What color do you think they were? Do you think they were white? Do you think they were real light-skinned people? Or do you think they were the same natives or the color of the same natives that Cristobal Colon had come in contact with all down through in South America, where he was going in and killing the natives and enslaving them and all of that? That's just a thought, since they want to tell you black folks weren't here, since they want to act like we weren't here, and since they will now give you these pictures of all of these white so-called Native Americans and all these real light and bright Native Americans, and they want you to think that that's what Native Americans look like. Because again, if you go into history and you look at the pictures, and you can Google many of them, you won't see a light-skinned so-called Native American prior to the 1800s. All of them were dark-skinned. All of them were clearly black people. Okay? Now, let me read that again. Instead of exploring, this Pedro dude captured 70 Native Americans for sale into slavery in Santo Domingo. Thus, the official start of Europe-imposed slavery in what we now call the U.S. began with the capture of peaceful Native Americans in 1521. In 1523, Leon obtained a permit from the Spanish King Charles V to explore and settle the continent. We're talking about North America now. They're already in South America. But now this Elion dude wants to be the first one to expand and have a settlement in North America. Undeterred by Quavo's violent start, in 1525, Elion again sent the slave capture to make peace with the natives. It is believed that Quavo explored as far north as Delaware Bay, obtaining men from several areas to return to Spain or establish colonies in order to learn the Spanish language and be used as interpreters. So this time he didn't necessarily go and capture anybody. Now he was getting folks to take back to Spain or to take back to the colonies so that they could learn Spanish so that they could later on be used as interpreters. Because these folks knew the native languages. The Spanish did not. And the natives were worried. They were very wary of these people. They didn't want to have no contact with these people. They didn't know these folks. They didn't know nothing about these folks. So they would go get people that were already natives, take them back to Spain or the colonies or whatever so that they could learn Spanish so that they could then have somebody to interpret for them. Okay? The first attempt at settlement and slavery on the continent would start off badly. In July 1526, De Leon sailed from Santo Domingo for South Carolina with 3 ships of 500 Spanish settlers, 100 horses, and 100 African slaves on board. So it was 600 people and 100 animals. And 3 ships. They landed near present-day Georgetown, South Carolina on September 29, 1526. Navigating upriver, they lost 1 ship immediately, and the Native Americans they were using as interpreters fled almost immediately upon making landfall. Now, one of the guys that they got, now, let me see if I can find, because I had it saved, but for some reason I can't find it. But I'm going to find. There it is. It was the article in the Washington Post. Yeah, this came from the Washington Post. This was done September 7th, 2019. All right. By the early 1520s, nearly all of the indigenous people in the Spanish colony of Hispaniola were dead. Right? Okay, Hispaniola is modern day Haiti. Right? That's what they named it. Well, it was already called Haiti. The Spanish came, took it over, and renamed it Hispaniola, and they settled it. You understand what I'm saying? And then the French came, and later on the French split it, and they had one part of it that they called Saint Dominique, I think, and then the other part was called Santo Domingo, but the whole island is Haiti, and that's what they did. They go in and they kill the whole indigenous population, just murdering folks, and they went looking for gold. That was the whole point, looking for gold, right? Enslaved Africans were brought in to replace them in the backbreaking search for gold that was getting harder and harder to find. This Elion dude, a government functionary in the colony, wanted to start a settlement of his own, and he got permission from the King and Queen of Spain to send scouts sailing up the east coast of what is now the United States to find a spot. According to historian and anthropologist Guy E. Cameron, that permission came with the specific instructions that they build a friendly relationship with any indigenous people they encountered. Right? Okay, well, the scouts returned with details of the coastline of what is now South Carolina and Georgia, and something else. 7 indigenous people they had abducted and enslaved. Okay, we just read over there that they got 70 people. Allione was angry. Kidnapping was not exactly a building block of comity and friendship. Still, he did not order their immediate return. Soon, the captives all started to die of sorrow and hunger, for they would not eat, according to a Spanish historian at the time. So they basically killed themselves. They basically committed suicide. They refused to eat. Right? Because they and this goes into what Tariq, Dr. Rashidi, and Dr. James Smalls, and so many others are bringing out about the enslaved African, is that the enslaved African never just accepted being enslaved. They always fought against it. In one way or the other, they always fought against enslavement. Suicide was one way. They fought against enslavement. That's the reason why you had so many enslaved Africans, the Africans who had been enslaved on those ships, because that's where the slavery actually began. Is on those borders, in those camps where they would keep them before they boarded the ships. That's where the enslavement actually started, and that's the reason why on those ships so many of them jumped overboard or threw their children overboard or whatever, because killing yourself was better than enslavement. So we've always fought against enslavement. But anyway, this is not about slavery. This is about the history of voting. So anyway, one of the captains, his name was Francisco. That was not his original name. That was the name that they gave him. You know, after they brought him over into Catholicism, and converted him, they gave him the name Francisco, right? Taught him Spanish. He picked up Spanish. This Allione man really grew to like him and all of that. Allione brought Francisco to Spain to help convince the king and queen that although the scouting missions had not gone as planned, they should still be allowed to colonize. Francisco, that was this native, told them how amazing the land was, talking about North America, just like Spain, and how welcoming his people, the Shakuri, would be. That was the name of his tribe, the Shakuri. That was the name of his people. He embellished quite a bit, Cameron wrote, and it is easy to see why. Convincing the Spanish to sail back to the Carolinas was the only way he could get back home, right? Well, the story goes on that permission was granted. Allione and this Francisco, the native, traveled to Hispaniola, where they gathered people and supplies for their settlement, right? Again, they left with 500 colonists, 500 animals, and 500 enslaved Africans on 3 ships. They arrived on August 9th and immediately ran into a big problem when one of the ships sank. They managed to rescue all of the passengers, but they lost most of their food. They lost most of the cargo that was on that ship. As soon as they were on land, Francisco, this is the native that they renamed Francisco, disappeared into the trees, leaving the colonists no way to communicate with their new neighbors. Because, see, he had learned Spanish. So they had him, that he was going to be their interpreter. He was going to be their go-between. But as soon as he got on land, he hit the trees and he disappeared. He was home. The colonists settled further south between South Carolina's Pee River and Georgia's Sapelo Island, named it San Miguel de Goldape, I don't know how to pronounce them words, and ordered the enslaved Africans to clear the land and start building homes and a church, right? They had arrived too late in the season to plant crops, however, and with the food supplies destroyed, the colonists began to starve. Plus, as Cameron's research with Stephen Vermette in the Georgia Historical Quarterly indicates, they experienced an unusually cold fall. Then an unknown infectious disease spread through the settlement, and a group of settlers who sought help from indigenous neighbors were killed. So they went trying to get help from the indigenous folks, and the indigenous folks killed them. Within a few months, 350 of the 150 settlers had died. It is unknown how many of the enslaved people perished. The Spanish did not keep account. Now remember, it was only according to the records, it was only 100 enslaved Africans. Then on October 18th, Elion himself died. His chosen successor did not sit well with some of the settlers, and two factions developed. Then the Spanish historian wrote, it happened that some of the Negro slaves independently set fire to a leader's house, and as the fire burnt, they all gathered to kill him. And in this way, they managed to escape. Thus, the first enslaved Africans known to have been brought to the continent were also the first to revolt. It appears that the Africans ran into the forest, never to be seen again. The same way the native Francisco had done as soon as they landed. He disappeared in the trees. Well, the Africans did the same thing. They ran into the trees, they ran into the forest, and they were never seen or heard from again. Weeks later, when the remaining Spanish bailed on the settlement and sailed away, there was no mention of any enslaved Africans on board. It is impossible to know what happened to the Africans when they escaped into the forest. There are no written records. Would the Shikori or another indigenous group have recognized them as victims of the Spanish and taken them in? Or would they have seen them as an extension of the colonizers and killed them? Would they have been able to survive on their own? Little is known about the Shikori today, but Cameron speculates they probably would have helped the Africans so long as it did not negatively impact their own preparations for winter. It is also possible some of the Africans traveled south as winter approached. Africans knew about the movement of the moon and stars. Of course they did. Africans were the original and chief astrologers. We know about nature. We know about astrology, mathematics, and all of that. And would have known that the weather would be warmer further south, Cameron wrote. Legends about black Indians, triracial isolate groups, and maroon communities abound in the southeastern United States. The Lumbee of North Carolina surmised they are descendants from Native Americans who intermarried with white settlers and freed African slaves. The brass ankles of South Carolina are believed to come from intermarried runaway African slaves, white indentured servants, and Native Americans. Although that is just a theory. They were classified as free people of color before the Civil War. Could some of their ancestors be those very first runaways? It is impossible to know. In 1920, black historian Carter G. Woodson observed, one of the longest unwritten chapters in the history of the United States is that treating the relationships of the Negroes and the Indians. So here's a little brief history lesson about where slavery really started on the northern continent. I mean, on the North American continent. Right there, 1526. It was the first incident of enslaved Africans being brought here, and it was the first incident of those enslaved Africans rising up, revolting, and escaping. And it is thoroughly believed that because of the color of their skin, because of their condition, you have to understand that this Francisco, the native that they had renamed Francisco, would have known that these Africans were enslaved. He would have known that they were slaves. He would have known that the Spanish enslaved them the same way they had captured and enslaved him and 69 other members of his tribe when they first got there. So yes, I thoroughly believe, as do many others, that upon escaping, that yes, they assimilated into the culture with other natives in the area because they saw folks that looked just like them. Okay. Now, my question to you is this: those 70 who were originally kidnapped and taken, and most of them killed themselves because they starved themselves to death. And this Francisco was among them. Those 70, once they were captured and enslaved, were they fighting to vote? Were they fighting for the right to vote? Were they concerned about voting? As a matter of fact, and he said they were for the Shakuri tribe, the Shakuri people. I wonder, did the Shakuri know anything about this so-called system of democracy and voting, and you got this party and that party, and you can vote for this one, and you can vote for that one? Do you think they even understood that concept of democracy or republic or whatever? Those 100 enslaved Africans that they brought into South Carolina in 1526. When they decided to get together, you understand what I'm saying? Come up with this plan, burn down this leader's house. You understand what I'm saying? Proceed to act on killing him or whatever, which gave them the guys to be able to run away or whatever. Do you think they were doing all of that so that they could vote? Do you think the concept of voting for somebody was a part of their reality? Or did they just want to be free? Did they just want to go back to the state that these enslavers had found them in? A state of being free. Okay. Now, let's go a little bit further. Because from then on, we see more and more instances of slaves. We see more and more instances of not only Africans being kidnapped, enslaved, and brought in here, but we also see a lot of native people, folks native to North America, being enslaved, right? So, we move down through history. We get to 1619, we get to the Gullah Gullah Wars, and we get to the Seminole Wars, what they call the Seminole Wars, the Black Wars down in Florida. Were those folks down there, and all those Maroons down there, were those folks fighting for the right to vote? Or were they just fighting for the right to live free? Were they being killed because they wanted to vote? Were they being hung and beat and raped and chopped up and mutilated and experimented on and all of this and bred out and used as breeders and all? Were they doing? Was all of that being done to them because they wanted to vote? Because now let's understand, whether we're talking about the Africans that were brought in and enslaved, or we're talking about the native people that were already here on this soil, none of them spoke the English language, right? Now they spoke a myriad of languages: Arabic, French, Dutch, Portuguese, Spanish, all kind of African dialects, all kind of native tongues. They spoke a myriad of languages, but none of them knew how to speak the English language, the king's language. And you have to understand, when they were enslaved here originally, this was not a country. This was not a republic. This was not a nation. This was just barren, open land. That the Spanish and the British and all of that eventually settled. So there was no voting going on here in North America. That didn't happen until after 1776. So for almost 200 years, you have black folks being enslaved on the North American continent, and it wasn't a nation yet. They were building the nation. These black slaves were building the nation. You understand what I'm saying? They were building the wealth for the nation. They were building it as well as building wealth all around the world. But this was not a democracy yet, where people were voting and there were elections and all of this kind of stuff, right? That didn't come until almost, like I said, 200 years later. Okay, but once it came, again, Harriet Tubman, Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, and all the different slaves that rebelled and that worked together in the Underground Railroad and worked together for freedom and escaped and became Maroons and all of this kind of stuff. Were any of them doing all of that so that they could vote? Or were they doing that for freedom? Because you have to remember, like I said, most of them didn't speak English. And when they did start learning this broken form of English, by law, they weren't allowed to read and write. So they didn't know anything about a political system, at least not the political system here. Now, they might have known about their political system in Africa or in whatever part of Africa they had been brought from. The natives that were already native to this land might have known about the tribal political system and the politics of the tribes and all of that. But they didn't know anything about these governments and these political systems of their enslavers, their oppressors. So where do we get this notion that they were being killed for the right to vote? Because they were fighting for the right to vote. No, they were being killed. They were being brutalized, dehumanized, raped, murdered, lynched, cut up, sodomized, all of that because they were black. They were being killed because they were black. Didn't have anything to do with voting. The last thing on these, on their slavers and their oppressors' minds was them voting. Because as far as the oppressor was concerned, as far as the enslaver was concerned, this was going to be a perpetual thing. This was a thing that was never going to stop. I own you. I own your children. I own your children's children. I own your children's children's children. I own you for generation after generation after generation after generation after generation. They saw no end to slavery. So the last thing on their minds is that one day their slaves would be able to vote. One day their property would be able to cast a vote. So they were not being killed. They were not being lynched. They were not being murdered and dismembered and pulled apart and all this because of a vote. That was all because they were black. They were black, they were poor, they were African, and they were considered property. So this notion that our ancestors died so that we could have the right to vote is foolish. It's absolutely foolish. again, is disrespectful because it infers that they made a choice to die while fighting for us to have the right to vote. No, they were murdered. They were butchered. They were slaughtered. And it didn't have anything to do with a vote. It was all because they were black. So let's stop passing on that foolishness. Let's stop regurgitating that foolishness. You understand what I'm saying? Let's stop spreading that lie. Let's stop giving credence to that lie. Because their struggles, their fights, their revolts, their uprisings didn't have anything to do with the ability to vote. It was all about, I just want to be free. I just want to be free. I just want to go somewhere and go back to the state that I was in before I was enslaved, where I was free. I just want to go back to being human again, so that I can stop being somebody's property and stop being treated like less than an animal. Because animals were treated better than the enslaved people. Okay? So let's stop perpetuating that lie. Because that's not what our ancestors were fighting for. And that's certainly not what they were killed for. Okay? Now, let's move on a little bit. Now, we know all during chattel slavery, antebellum slavery, that these folks didn't vote. You understand what I'm saying? We know they didn't vote. We know they didn't participate in politics. We know they didn't have anything to do with any of that, right? But there came a time when they actually could. And it was after 1865, the Emancipation Proclamation, and the 13th Amendment, okay? So, where is it? All right, here it is. Now, this is coming from Senate.gov. And it's landmark legislation, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. All right? Now, I'm just going to give you just a little brief overview of the 13th Amendment. Although Congress abolished slavery in the District of Columbia in 1862, and President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation ended the practice of slavery in rebellious states in 1863, at war's end in 1865, the question of slavery had not been resolved at the national level. At the state level, yes, but not at the national level. The federal government, and you have to understand that it was the federal government that made slavery a law. Not individual states, but the federal government the federal government made slavery a law. Said that slavery was okay. Sanctioned slavery. And then the individual states did their things with it. Okay? So it was going to have to be taken care of at the federal government level, right? The federal government required new state constitutions in former Confederate states to include the abolition of slavery. But there was nothing to prevent states from reinstating the practice with revised state constitutions. Senators Lyman Trumbull of Illinois, Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, and John Henderson of Missouri sponsored resolutions for a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery nationwide. Because see, prior to these amendments, you were still three-fifths of a person. Black. You were still three-fifths of a person. You were still considered property. The 13th Amendment, passed by the Senate on April 8, 1864, by the House on January 31, 1865, and ratified by the states on December 6, 1865, abolished slavery within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Congress required former Confederate states to ratify the 13th Amendment as a condition of regaining federal representation. Okay? Yeah, let's see here. Let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger. Because it's in the 13th Amendment, where the 13th Amendment says that slavery has been abolished, except and unless. And that except and unless part is the part that still really, really screws black people. So, I want to read that whole 13th Amendment to you. Hold on, I'm gonna find it. I'm looking at it, but I just got to get it big enough so I can read it. Here it is. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist. They're talking about slavery. Shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. See, it's that little part right there. Except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. So if you're duly convicted, which means if you are convicted by a jury of your peers and you have gone through the whole court process and all of that, and you are convicted, then you enter back into slavery or at least involuntary servitude. Because you committed a crime. You understand what I'm saying? You were convicted of that crime. So you enter back into slavery or at least no less than involuntary servitude, which is slavery. Prison. Okay? Now, well, now hold on. Then after that, let's go back to our original. We get the 14th Amendment. Ratified July 9th, 1868, the 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including former enslaved persons, and provided all citizens with equal protection under the law, extending the provisions of the Bill of Rights to the states. The amendment authorized the government to punish states that abridged citizens' rights to vote by proportionally reducing their representation in Congress. It banned those who engaged in insurrection against the United States from holding any civil, military, or elected office without the approval of 2/3 of the House and Senate. The amendment prohibited former Confederate states from repaying war debts and compensating former slave owners for the emancipation of their enslaved people. Because, you know, prior to the 13th Amendment and the end of the Civil War, they actually paid reparations to the former slave owners, right? I think they got $300 per slave or something like that. Finally, it granted Congress the power to enforce this amendment, a provision that led to the passage of other landmark legislation in the 20th century, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Congress required former Confederate states to ratify the 14th Amendment as a condition of regaining federal representation. 15th Amendment. As a member of the Senate Committee on the Judiciary, William Stewart of Nevada guided the 15th Amendment through the Senate. Ratified February 3rd, 1870, the amendment prohibited states from disenfranchising voters on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The amendment left open the possibility, however, that states could institute voter qualifications equally to all races. And many former Confederate states took advantage of this provision, instituting poll tax and literacy tests among other qualifications. Okay, see, that literacy test was definitely geared towards targeting black folks, because black folks, you only been out of slavery 5 years. Prior to 1865, it was against the law for anybody to teach you to read or write. So how are you going to pass a literacy test? The Reconstruction Amendments to the Constitution extended new constitutional protections to African Americans, though the struggle to fully achieve equality will continue into the 20th century. Okay, so that's the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, right? Okay, so by 1870, you got black folks voting. You got former slaves voting. Okay, now let's go into this document right here. The war is over. You understand what I'm saying? The Reconstruction era has started. The Reconstruction era was supposed to mean the reconstructing or the rebuilding of America, especially the South, because the South was an absolute mess. And it was also supposed to be a period where the racial relationship was being reconstructed, because now you have approximately 4 million black folks that are all of a sudden free, with no education, no money. You understand what I'm saying? They got skills. They got plenty of skills, but they had no education, no money, no land. You understand what I'm saying? Didn't own anything. And now all of a sudden, what you gonna do with this approximately 4 million black folks, right? All right. Now, I found this article very, very interesting and very informative. Okay. Your vote, your voice. Your voice.org. The Reconstruction era, 1865 to 1877, right? It only lasted 12 years, and we'll get to what happened to it. After the Civil War, the Reconstruction era, 1865 to 1877, brought enormous change to Africans' political life. Reconstructed Southern state governments, new laws, and constitutional amendments all expanded voting rights for African American men. But by the 1880s, as federal intervention diminished, most southern states prevented African American men from voting by using a combination of laws, economic pressure, and intimidation. Most African Americans in the South only regained real access to the polls in the 1960s. Okay? Setting the stage. After the Civil War, the country worked to reconstruct the economy, the destroyed lands and transportation routes, and its war-torn communities. Politics shifted with the abolition of slavery and with the federal government having control over the laws in the South. During Reconstruction, black political power expanded dramatically, and it did. Now all of a sudden you got black folks voting. You got black men running for political office and winning. You got black men holding very high political office. You saw black men becoming senators and things of that nature. You saw black men becoming heads in the legislative body, in bodies in these states. It really did expand, right? During Reconstruction, black political power expanded dramatically. More than 1,500 African American men held public office in the South. 16 African Americans served in Congress during Reconstruction, and at least 600 served in state legislatures, with hundreds more in local offices. So that's how quick it happened. You understand what I'm saying? You have to remember that in the first 10 years of Reconstruction, between 1865 and 1865 and wait a minute. And 1875, black folks brought their literacy rate up by 90%. I mean, they started going to school. They started opening schools. All kinds of stuff. I think Tuskegee was open during that time. There were other black schools that were open. I mean, black folks just exploded. They started buying and owning land. All kinds of stuff was taking place. Why? Because the federal government was offering all kinds of, along with all of these laws, they were offering all kinds of programs to help the newly freed slaves become real active parts of American society, or so we thought. Let's keep reading. However, race and gender relations were still incredibly divided. By 1877, the federal government withdrew their troops from the South, and legal mechanisms such as Jim Crow laws were quickly created to reverse the political and civil gains of African Americans in the South. This period of especially poor race relations in the U.S. is called the nadir, and it continued into the first 2 decades of the 20th century. I would go as far as to say it's still continuing. It's still going on. And then down here it gives you a history of African Americans in Minnesota, and them voting and all of this kind of stuff, and fighting for the right to vote, and winning that vote and all of that. But this good thing couldn't last, right? This good thing couldn't last. Now remember, this is the history of black voting in America. So between 1865 and 1877, you understand what I'm saying? You have black folks starting their own branch of the Republican Party in Texas. You got black folks running things in Wilmington. You got black folks in New Orleans in political power and holding office. You got black folks all over the nation. Black men holding high political office, right? And having the right to vote. So, but then something happened. I'm looking for an article, y'all. Something happened. Something happened that changed a whole lot of stuff. Hold on. Hold on. I'm just pulling up some stuff. I'm just pulling up some articles because I got so much stuff up here. I got so many tabs up here until I'm going to have to pull them up a little bit at a time. Ah, that's already up. Okay. You even got in 1865, after the 13th and the 14th Amendments were ratified, you even got a Civil Rights Act of 1866. And this is this Civil Rights Act of 1866 that Byron Allen was trying to use in his thing with Comcast and that Tone kept talking about and all of that. The Civil Rights Act of the Civil Rights Acts of 1866 and 1875 were passed by the U.S. Congress in an effort to make full citizens of and guarantee the rights of the freed slaves. The 13th Amendment, 1865, had abolished slavery throughout the nation, and Congress was faced with how to enfranchise this population. How do we get them in? How do we get them, how do we assimilate them into the society? You understand? How do we work this thing out? Both pieces of legislation proved to be controversial. Early in 1866, Congress approved an act which stated that states could not infringe on the rights of their citizens. But President Andrew Johnson, 808 to 75, vetoed it. When the South receded from the Union in 1861, Johnson, then a senator from Tennessee, remained in Washington, D.C. He believed the Act of Succession was unconstitutional. When President Abraham Lincoln, 61 through 65, that's when he was president, ran for a second term in 1864, he chose the Southern Democrat as his running mate in an effort to heal the nation's wounds. Having won the election, the Democrat. So you gotta so see, there's always been this working together of the Republicans and the Democrats. You understand what I'm saying? White supremacy always works together. Having won the election, Lincoln had just begun his second term when he was assassinated. Johnson succeeded him in office. When the Civil Rights Act arrived on his desk, Johnson refused to sign it. He had always been a firm believer in the rights of states to regulate their own affairs. For the first time in history, Congress mustered enough votes to overturn a presidential veto and enacted the law anyway. It was the first of numerous veto overturns that came during the years of Reconstruction, 65 to 77, as Congress and the president squared off over how to restore the Union. In June 1866, Congress proposed the 14th Amendment, which gave citizenship to all African Americans, former slaves, and guaranteed that all laws, both federal and state, applied equally to African Americans and whites. Congress further required that no Southern state could be readmitted to the Union. At the time, none had been readmitted without first ratifying the 14th Amendment. The amendment was ratified in 1868, replacing the earlier disputed legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1875, passed by Congress on March 1st of that year, aimed to protect all citizens from discrimination in places of public accommodation. In part, it stated that all persons within the jurisdiction of the United States shall be entitled to the full and equal enjoyment of the accommodations, advantages, facilities, and privileges of inns, public conveyances, transportation, on land or water, theaters, and other places of public amusement, and applicable alike to citizens of every race and color. 8 years later, the legislation was struck down as unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court. So see, the U.S. Supreme Court has never been a friend to foundational Black Americans. Never been a friend to Black folks, which stated that Congress does not have the authority to regulate the prevalent social mores of any state. The ground covered by the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was later covered anew by Congress in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So it took another, what, 90 years, 89 years, which bans discrimination based on a person's color, race, national origin, religion, or sex. So it took another 90 years, because 1975 would have been 100 years. So it took another 89 years for us to get that back, what we had in the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which the U.S. Supreme Court said back then was unconstitutional. Okay? So now I'm just telling you all the things that we got during Reconstruction. Right? But we got this stuff not through the states, but we got this directly from the federal government. And these amendments to the Constitution, these Civil Rights Acts, and all of this was coming straight from the federal government. And in order for these southern states, because the South had been defeated in the war, in order for them to be brought back into the Union, they had to ratify these amendments and these Civil Rights Acts. Okay? So yes, we made many strides in that 12 years. 1865 to 1877. We made many strides. And yes, Black folks, Black men were voting. And again, like I said, holding public office in Congress, the whole 9 yards. But white supremacy didn't like that. And white supremacy was just biding its time. Now, let's see when that happened. I just want to make sure that I'm not getting ahead of myself. Let's see when that happened. Okay, let me find my other massacre, because we're going to get into these massacres. Oh, yeah, I'm taking my time with this tonight. This one ain't going to be short. Let me see. If I can find it. I thought I had saved it. Let me see if I can find it. I might have to go back and find it again, because I don't see it. Ah, there it is. Okay. So, in 1866, we got construction. We got Reconstruction. We got the Civil Rights Act of 1866. We got Black folk, Black men voting. We got some stuff going on. But 1866 proved to not be such a great time in New Orleans, because this was the time of the New Orleans Massacre, right? 1866. Now, this is coming from blackpost.org, April 7, 2011, by Michael Stolp Smith. The New Orleans Massacre, also known as the New Orleans Race Riots. I don't know why they ever call them race riots, because it's always white folks, the dominant society, raising up against Black folks and killing up a whole lot of Black folks and destroying stuff and all of that. But anyway, it was the New Orleans Massacre. Occurred on July 30th, 1866. While the riot was typical of numerous racial conflicts during Reconstruction, This incident had special significance. It galvanized national opposition to the moderate Reconstruction policies of President Andrew Johnson and ushered in much more sweeping congressional Reconstruction in 1867. The riot took place outside the Mechanics Institute in New Orleans as black and white delegates attended the Louisiana Constitutional Convention. The convention had reconvened because the Louisiana state legislature had recently passed the black codes and refused to extend voting rights to black men. Right? Okay, so even though the war's over, we got the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment. We got the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Let's see when that came about. Early 1866. Okay. Okay, so it was April 1866, when they overturned Johnson's veto of the 1866 Civil Rights Bill. Okay, so the 1866 Civil Rights Bill has just passed. All of this stuff is going on. But these folks in Louisiana have just recently passed more black codes. So they were just refusing to have any part of all of this new stuff that was supposed to be going on with these former slaves, right? Also, on May 12, 1816, 4 years of Union Army imposed martial law ended, and Mayor John T. Monroe, who had headed city government before the Civil War, was reinstated as acting mayor. Monroe had been an active supporter of the Confederacy, right? As a delegation of 130 black New Orleans residents marched behind the U.S. flag toward the Mechanics Institute, Mayor Monroe organized and led a mob of ex-Confederates, white supremacists, and members of the New Orleans police force to the Institute to block their way. Okay? So he got him some ex-Confederates, white supremacists, white supremacists, and members of the New Orleans police force, white supremacists. He got him a bunch of white supremacists. You understand what I'm saying? Headed to the Institute to block the way of these 130 black men. The mayor claimed their intent was to put down an unrest that may come from the convention, but the real reason was to prevent the delegates from meeting. As the delegation came to within a couple of blocks of the Institute, shots were fired, but the group was allowed to proceed to the meeting hall. Once they reached the Institute, the police and white mob members attacked them, beating some of the marchers while others rushed inside the building for safety. Now the police and mob surrounded the Institute and opened fire on the building, shooting indiscriminately into the windows. What does that remind you of? Just shooting indiscriminately into windows and buildings and all that kind of stuff. What does that remind you of? What does it remind you of when you got police outside of a building just firing into windows and shooting indiscriminately into an occupied building? Breonna Taylor? Then the mob rushed into the building and began to fire into the crowd of delegates. When the mob ran out of ammunition, they were beaten back by the delegates. The mob left the building, regrouped, and returned, breaking down the doors and again firing on the mostly unarmed delegates. As the firing continued, some delegates attempted to flee or surrender. Some of those who surrendered, mostly blacks, were killed on the spot because there were other delegates there, but it was 130 black ones. Now, the ones who surrendered were killed on the spot. Those who ran were chased as the killing spread over several blocks around the Institute. By this time, both the rioters and victims included people who were never at the Institute. African Americans were shot on the street or pulled off of streetcars to be summarily beaten or killed. By the end of the massacre, at least 200 black Union War veterans were killed, including 40 delegates at the convention. Altogether, 238 people were killed and 46 were wounded. The riot's repercussions extended far beyond New Orleans. Northerners angry over the violence helped the Republican Party take control of the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate in the congressional elections of 1866. That Republican-controlled Congress subsequently passed the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, a series of measures that called for army occupation of 10 former Confederate states and measures that ensured voting rights for African Americans. Meanwhile, martial law was immediately reimposed in New Orleans after the riot, and Mayor Monroe and other city officials were forcibly removed from office for their part in the massacre. But of course, nobody was arrested and punished. Of course, none of these white supremacists, none of these members of the police force, you understand, and none of these ex-Confederates, this Monroe, none of them were actually charged and punished with a crime. They were just forcibly removed from office, okay? But it was this incident that led to the KKK, this incident and some other incidents that led to the KKK acts, okay? Now, well, while all of this is going on, and these black folks is getting all of these amendments, and they getting all these rights to vote, and all of this kind of stuff, while all of this is going on, you got massacres and all of this. While all of this is going on, something else is brewing, okay? Let's talk about what else was brewing. Now, this comes from news.com.au. And this was December the 25th, 2018 by L.J. Charleston. How the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, began its reign of terror on Christmas Eve. Let me light my cigarette. 6 Confederate soldiers gathered as a social group on Christmas Eve to discuss political matters. Their circle would turn into the KKK. All right? So let's go into the history of the KKK. Because you can't talk about the history of the black vote in America without talking about the KKK. Because that's one of the main reasons why the KKK was born, right? Hold on a minute, y'all. I got to get me a little bit of libation. Hold on a minute. Yeah, my throat getting dry, so I just need me a little something to drink for this dry throat. Oh yeah, we're gonna be here for a minute because I got to break this down. And since I'm not like Tariq, I'm not a walking history book. Tariq Nasheed is a walking history book. I got to do this my way. All right, now, okay, let's get back to class. All righty, now, here we go. What began on Christmas Eve, 1865, as a social group grew to a terror organization that by the 1920s reached peak membership of up to 6 million people across the United States. From its humble beginnings, the Ku Klux Klan heralds a horrific chapter in American history that still exists today, 150 years after its initial formation. The aftermath of the Civil War gave around 4 million African Americans their freedom, but there were several obstacles to successfully rebuilding the South during what was known as the Reconstruction period of 1865 to 1877. From 1865 to 1871, the first wave of the KKK killed hundreds of African Americans and their white supporters, driving thousands of families from their homes, sexually assaulting thousands of women and men. Okay? Now remember, we got all of this buck breaking going on these plantations, where these these southern planters and these plantation owners and slave owners and all of that were not just raping the black women, the enslaved black women, but they were also raping and sodomizing these enslaved black men. So you see here that even after all that and after the Civil War was over, you still had Klan members that were sexually assaulting thousands of women and men, okay? The KKK launched a campaign of horrendous racism, coupled with violence and terror, as well as widespread robbery, as they stole all possessions of African Americans, from guns to lands to food and livestock. It's no wonder at least one historian refers to the Ku Klux Klan as America's recurring nightmare. America's recurring nightmare. So you got to understand now. You got to understand the real reason for the forming of the Klan. Okay? Now, the next topic, the first wave of the KKK. The name Ku Klux Klan comes from the Greek word kaklos, meaning circle. It's believed the word clan was added simply for alliteration reasons. It was officially founded on Christmas Eve, 1865, in Pulaski, Tennessee. Former Confederate cavalry general and slave trader Nathan Bedford Forrest was the KKK's first leader-in-chief, otherwise known as the Grand Wizard. The Klan apparently liked quirky titles. All right. Forrest originally formed the KKK as a paramilitary. Think of these militia groups, paramilitary group that included 6 Confederate soldiers in the aftermath of the American Civil War. At first, the men primarily discussed ways to reverse the federal government's progressive policies. They saw themselves as representing the white people who once had the power, but now resented the freed slaves and feared retaliation. So supposedly they feared retaliation from the freed slaves. So supposedly they were afraid, I guess, that at some point the slaves, the now freed slaves, would rise up and do to them what they had done to the freed slaves, right? Well, you know, they say, and I've been told this and I've seen this for myself, they say that anger is more a sign of fear than anything else. And to hide the fear, you show anger to hide the fear. And then you're angry with yourself for being afraid. Okay, so and like I said, I've seen it myself that a lot of people, when they are afraid, they get angry. Now they mess around and get angry at the wrong person, or they get angry at the wrong group of people, or whatever. But because they are afraid, they use anger to cover up that fear. Right? Let's read that again. They saw themselves as representing the white people who once had the power, but now resented the freed slaves and feared retaliation. The original KKK planned to mostly intimidate the former slaves who were legally granted civil rights protections after the war. The Klan was particularly concerned about policies that increased the rights of the African Americans. The meeting soon turned into something more sinister, a group that, above all else, pledged to hold on to their white supremacist agenda. It didn't take long for the entire ideology of the KKK to shift focus, throwing a spotlight on the bitterness and anger many felt about the disenfranchisement of the South in the Reconstruction era. Now, now let's look at this from a psychological standpoint, right? The South was booming. All of these folks, I mean, the antebellum South was a lifestyle on all its own. You understand what I'm saying? And it was that slave that made that possible. It was the slave that made that lifestyle possible. It was the slave that made the old South, as they call it, possible. Now, not only have you lost the slave, you understand what I'm saying? Not only have you lost that lifestyle, not only have you lost all the finery and all the gentility and all the money and everything that came with that lifestyle off the back and the hard work and the free labor of the slave. Not only have you lost the slave as your property, you lost all the rest of your property as well. And then on top of that, you have been made a laughing stock of the entire nation as well as the entire world. Yeah, you mad. You mad, you bitter, you angry, you humiliated, the whole 9 yards. And whose fault is it? Not yours, for having the audacity to think that you had the right to own another human being. Oh, no, not your fault. You can't take responsibility for it. Well, you're not going to make it another white man's fault. So eventually, who do you blame? You blame the slave. You say you blame the slave for having the audacity to want to be free. You blame the slave for having the audacity to want to claim rights and citizenship, you understand what I'm saying, in the nation that he built. All right. It didn't take long for the entire ideology of the KKK to shift focus, throwing a spotlight on the bitterness and anger many felt about the disenfranchisement of the South in the Reconstruction era. Its members saw the freed African Americans and their allies as their enemies, as well as the Republican opposition, and made life incredibly frightening for anyone perceived to be an enemy. It was a truly frightening time for all African Americans and anyone that tried to help them. So you have to understand, the target was not just black folks. The target was black folks and anybody else who had the audacity to help black folks. So when we say that white supremacy will take out their own, yeah, you get off code, and helping black folks in their struggle is you getting off code. Yeah, we take you out too. We wipe you out too. We intimidate you and frighten you and terrorize you the same way we do them niggas. Because as another white person, how dare you go against our enemy and fight with our enemy. I mean, go against us, fight with our enemy against us. Historian Linda Gordon is the author of The Second Coming of the KKK. According to Gordon, founding leader Forrest tried to break up the KKK in 1869 when he realized the group was becoming excessively violent. I don't know whether I believe that or not. But this was an impossible task as the Klan was already too powerful by then. Gordon claims the entire success of the Klan, of the KKK, rested on its ability to trade on fear. I believe that because that's what it is. It is America's #1 terror organization. Always has been, always will be. Now, yes, it has branched out into other things now. The Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys, this militia over here, that militia over there. It has branched out into other things. But this is its root. This is its core right here. And its core has always been terror. But then that is what white supremacy has always used against black folks. Terror. That's what the slave patrols were for. To terrorize the black slave populace to keep them under control. Well, as far as the Klan was concerned, these uppity niggas were out of control. We got to bring them back under control. We've got to remind them that they are still the slave and we are still the master. The Klan generated widespread terror by planting false allegations, mostly centered on black men being sexually aggressive towards white women. Their false accusations made white women fearful, and the KKK used that fear to justify their white terrorism. The KKK liked to ride their horses at night, threatening and frightening any black people they could find. If anyone defied them, they were whipped, beaten, and often murdered, typically called lynchings. So yes, there were lynchings during slavery, but we didn't get the height of lynching until the Klan was born. And I would say between the 1860s and the 1950s is when we saw just that horrific burst of lynchings. Historian Elaine France Parsons wrote in Ku Klux, The Birth of the Klan During Reconstruction, that the Klan insisted on continuing the Southern tradition of night riders who intimidated slaves to control them. So the night riders could actually be the precursor to the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan also extended their hostilities to the Southern whites who befriended and defended African Americans. Wearing their costumes, the KKK would shoot into windows, often burning houses with the occupants still inside. Those they didn't kill, they drove off their properties, destroying their farms and leaving successful black farmers with nothing. So see, the burning and the looting and destroying our stuff didn't start with Black Wall Street and some of those other prominent communities that they burnt and destroyed. It started right here, right after the Emancipation and the 13th Amendment, the end of slavery, right after the Civil War, when black folks began being successful, began buying land, owning farms and all of that. It started out with the Klan going in and running people out, burning up all their stuff, burning their homes, burning their farms, burning up all their livestock and all of that. But you got to remember now, black folks got the right to vote. They got the right to vote. They have not lost the right to vote. Okay? They have not lost the right to vote. They have the right to vote. Okay? By 1877, the federal government had disbanded any guarantee of the rights of the freed people, the freed slaves. This meant the KKK could operate without any opposition. The small number of Southern white elites who were opposed to the KKK justified government inaction by defending the Klan as a private, non-state organization of poor, uneducated white trash. So police and courts were powerless to control it. Now, even though they were opposed to the KKK, they justified the government's inaction by saying, oh, they just poor, uneducated white trash. You know, it's just this private organization. You understand what I'm saying? So the police and the courts have no power over them. So they can just run rampant and kill whoever they want to kill, terrorize whoever they want to terrorize, burn down anything they want to do. And the police and the courts supposedly aren't supposed to have any control over it. Gordon writes, that excuse was bogus. Police and sheriffs colluded with and often joined the Klan, ensuring that it could operate with impunity. Right? Okay, so we're trying to say now, federal government came out with this report that we have delved into and talked about right here on this channel, in 2006, saying that the Ku Klux Klan had infiltrated law enforcement, sometimes at the very highest level. This right here plainly lets you know, no, the Klan didn't infiltrate law enforcement. The Klan has always been a part of law enforcement. The Klan has always joined forces. Law enforcement has always joined forces with the Klan. Why? Because you have to understand, law enforcement is white supremacy too. Law enforcement was created by white supremacy the same way the Klan was created by white supremacy. So the Klan never had to infiltrate law enforcement. The Klan has always been a part of law enforcement. Law enforcement has always been a part of the Klan. Hand in hand. White supremacy. Hand in hand. Okay? Those who justified inaction also claimed that the Klan robes, hoods, and masks made it impossible to identify Klan members. This too was not actually true. In most communities, the identities of Klansmen were well known. Yeah, most of the black and white folks knew who the Klan members were. That was part of the terror. To know that your local sheriff, you understand what I'm saying? Or the local doctor, or the local judge, or the judge's son was a member of the Klan. So you knew when they rolled on you that night, if you survived it, who were you going to tell? Where was any help going to come from? The end of the first wave of the KKK. By the time Forrest tried to disband the KKK, his organization was already more terrifying and powerful than he ever intended. President Ulysses S. Grant had passed the Ku Klux Act, in 1871, authorizing the military to crush what was then a terrorist group. The act meant 9 South Carolina counties were placed under martial law. Then, in 1882, there was a huge backflip with the U.S. Supreme Court declaring the Ku Klux Act unconstitutional. Again, I'm telling you, the U.S. Supreme Court has never been a friend to the black man. Never been. And we got black folks now in 2020 running around talking about where Biden gonna put this one on the court and Trump gonna put that one on the Supreme Court and all that. Like, what that's got to do with us? The Supreme Court has never been our friend. This led to grave fears the Klan would rise again. But by then, it had mostly disappeared. It didn't really disappear. It just kind of went underground a little while. But it didn't disappear. It went underground a little bit, regrouped a little bit, okay? The birth of a nation. During World War I, 1914 to 1918, the KKK started to reorganize, said to be fueled by a movie, The Birth of a Nation, which featured a story about the first KKK defending white people against blacks. Now, in this movie, this was white supremacy propaganda up one side and down the other. It shows black folks just running over folks and just taking over. It shows black folks in the South just mistreating white folks and all of this. And because them black folks and them niggas them got so far out of hand and all of that, so that's the reason why the Klan had to rise up again to protect these innocent white people, these poor white folks who are just being mistreated and all that by these former slaves, these niggas. The film was deeply controversial. Its depiction of the Klan was ludicrously as saviors of the rest of the population. When the movie was shown in Des Moines, Iowa in 1916, the National Association for the Achievement, well, the NAACP, held a peaceful protest. Of course they did. What other kind of protest is the NAACP gonna hold? It was the first time in history the association had been called to action because they feared there'd be renewed backlash against African Americans. But the protest did little to prevent the next wave of the KKK. According to historian Linda George, by 1920 the KKK had gained peak membership, appealing to those who believed their lives were superior to those of immigrants. Now, I don't understand what immigrants got to do with this. The Klan, but anyway, this new version of the Klan went beyond discriminating just against African Americans. They spread their net of evil even wider. Now their hate focused on immigrants, Catholic, Jews, and colored people. Its ideology shifted once again. Now the Klan supported what they call clean living and attacked dope, bootlegging, graft, nightclubs, and roadhouses, violation of the Sabbath, unfair business dealings, sex, marital goings-ons, and scandalous behavior. The KKK members made their own costumes of white robes with conical hats and masks designed to frighten people as well as to hide their identities. So, you know, they always try to act like black folks were stupid and black folks were you know, talking about them spooks are scared of spooks and all of this kind of stuff. So that's the reason why they did this white robe thing with the eyes cut out and all of that. I guess it's supposed to be symbolizing a ghost or something like that, because black folks were supposed to be, you know, because we into this spirit world and voodoo and all this kind of stuff, we supposed to be scared of ghosts, I guess, you know, whatever. According to historian Allison Kinney, while the pointed white hood and robe is now synonymous with the KKK, it was more common for members to wear a variety of costumes, including using blackface to mock their victims. Klansmen wore gigantic animal horns, fake beards, dark-skinned caps, or polka dot paper hats. They imitated French accents or barnyard animals. They played guitars to serenade victims. Some Klansmen wore pointed hats suggestive of wizards, dunces, and peyotes. Some wore everyday winter hoods, pillowcases, or flour sacks on their heads, Kinney writes. Later, the costume was seen as less a disguise and more of a way to show others you were part of the KKK. This same Linda George woman says the purpose of the costume wasn't always to protect identities, because most locals knew exactly who the Klan members were beneath their disguise. This new wave of the Klan started in 1915, led by William J. Simons in Stone Mountain, Georgia. Cross burning became a signature symbol of the Klan's hatred and is still seen as a sacred ceremony for members. Historians refer to the second wave as a time when Klan members served in all levels of government. So you could no longer accuse them of just being uneducated, poor white trash. Now you got them in all levels of government. And now you got doctors, you got lawyers, you got teachers, schools teachers, principals. You got folks from everywhere. Educated white folks, okay? Interestingly, while the KKK identify with the Protestant religion, they don't see cross burning as sacrilegious, but rather a symbol of their Christianity. The Klan started to diminish by the end of the 1920s when membership shrunk from 5 to 6 million to just a few thousand. According to Linda George, this decline had very little to do with any kind of opposition. Instead, she writes, it withered from the inside. Members resented the national headquarters, steady demand for dues and other levies, corrupt leaders were caught drinking and embezzling, and one grand goblin was convicted of a murder so vicious that it evoked national media attention. So basically, it was that satanic house that a house divided can't stand, you know. So they're saying that the decline came from the inside. The decline did not, however, mean that Klan ideas died out. A third wave of the KKK began again in 1950, focusing on the civil rights movement. Historians have differing views on the KKK's central values. Historian Leonard J. Moore believed the KKK of the 1920s was the story of a backward segment of American society, one trapped by economic insecurity, dying small-town ways, and an inability to adjust psychologically to the modern age. The KKK continues today, but almost every Christian denomination denounces its existence. So now that's just a little history on the KKK. But what you have to understand is, while the KKK was doing all that they were doing between 1865 and 1877, the Reconstruction era, black folks had the right to vote. We were voting. We were holding public office. We were holding seats in Congress. But funny how we couldn't vote away white supremacy. Funny how we couldn't vote away that hatred of us because we're black. Funny how the federal government, with all of its amendments, 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, Civil Rights Act of 66, the Ku Klux Klan Acts, let's read about them. The Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871. The adoption of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution extended civil and legal protections to former slaves and prohibited states from disenfranchising voters on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Forces in some states were at work, however, to deny black citizens their legal rights. Members of the Ku Klux Klan, for example, terrorized black citizens for exercising their rights to vote, running for public office, and serving on juries. In response, Congress passed a series of enforcement acts in 1870 and 1871, also known as the Force Acts, also known as the Ku Klux Acts, to end such violence and empower the president to use military force to protect African Americans. In its first effort to counteract such use of violence and intimidation, Congress passed the Enforcement Act of May 1870, which prohibited groups of people from banding together or to go in disguise upon the public highways or upon the premises of another with the intention of violating citizens' constitutional rights. Even this legislation did not diminish harassment of black voters in some areas. In December 1870, Senator Oliver H.P.T. Morton, an Indiana Republican, introduced a resolution requesting the president to communicate any information he had about certain incidents of threatened resistance to the execution of the laws of the United States. After the Senate adopted Morton's resolution, President Ulysses S. Grant submitted several War Department reports relating to events in several southern states. These reports were referred to the Select Committee of the Senate to investigate the alleged outrages in the southern states, chaired by Senator Henry Wilson of Massachusetts. In the next Congress, the Joint Select Committee to inquire into the condition of affairs in the late insurrectionary states broadened that mandate. While these committees were investigating Southern attempts to impede Reconstruction, the Senate passed two more Force Acts, also known as the Ku Klux Klan Acts, designed to enforce the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act of 1866. The Second Force Act, which became law in February 1871, placed administration of national elections under the control of the federal government and empowered federal judges and the United States Marshals to supervise local polling places. The Third Force Act, dated April 1871, empowered the president to use the armed forces to combat those who conspired to deny equal protection of the laws and to suspend habeas corpus if necessary to enforce the act. While the Force Acts and the publicity generated by the Joint Committee temporarily helped put an end to the violence and intimidation, the end of formal Reconstruction in 1877 allowed for a return of large-scale disenfranchisement of African Americans. Okay? So you got all of these acts. You got all of these acts of Congress. You got enforcement acts. You got Ku Klux Klan acts. You got the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. You got Civil Rights Act of 1866. You even got the Civil Rights Act of 1875, even though it was later on overturned, but it stood for a minute. You got all of this legislation. But you still couldn't get rid of white supremacy. You still couldn't get rid of that hatred. You still couldn't get rid of that I'm superior to you because I'm white and you black. You still couldn't get rid of that ideology. You still couldn't get rid of that mindset. Why? Because you cannot legislate white supremacy. You cannot legislate away white supremacy. If that was the case, we wouldn't be bothered with it today. We wouldn't be seeing it today. If you could legislate it away, all of that legislation that we just talked about, all of those different and several laws that were passed and enforced. See, this was a time when they were actually enforcing the laws that they were passing. So if you could legislate white supremacy, it would be gone now. We wouldn't have to deal with it no more. And you got to remember, throughout all of this, from 1865 to 1877, black folk had the right to vote. Well, black men had the right to vote. Not only did they have the right to vote, they were holding public office. They were holding Senate seats. But you can't vote away white supremacy. White supremacy is not something that can be reformed. It's not something that can be legislated away. It's not something that can be voted away. White supremacy is something that's going to have to be destroyed. It is going to have to be completely and totally dismantled, destroyed, and a whole new system is going to have to be put in its place. Now you have to understand, this is the history of black folk having the vote before 1877 for 12 years. And this is all that took place in 12 years. As soon as the black man began to rise, white supremacy rose up and said, we can't have that. And gave birth to the Ku Klux Klan. But now, let's talk about what brought an end to black folk, black men, originally having the right to vote. Okay? Let's talk about that. Hold on, let me find what I'm looking for. I got so many up here. I got so many whatchamacall is up here now. So many tabs open. All right, now here we go. Let's find it. All right, it's opening up. There we go. Yeah, y'all bear with me. Y'all bear with me, but I told you I was going to bring you a history lesson. So y'all just bear with me. Stop screaming. I'm just talking to my daughter. Y'all, I'm waiting for this article from history.com to come on up. All right. Now, I'm sure most of you have heard of the Great Compromise of 1877. But for those of you who haven't, there is the Compromise of 1877, which is also known as the Great Betrayal, right? And when this thing stops loading, we're going to talk about the Great Betrayal. The Great Betrayal of 1877.
The Civil War ends in 1865, and the Union Army celebrates with a triumphant parade down Washington's Pennsylvania Avenue.
Okay, and that's a video in this article, and all these articles will be listed in the description box, so you can go back, you can read, you can look at these videos, that type of thing. But we're going to talk about Compromise of 1877. This was updated November, excuse me, 27, 2019, but it originally came out March 17, 2011. Compromise of 1877, and this is by the history.com editors. The Compromise of 1877 was an informal agreement, an agreement reached during a secret meeting between Southern Democrats and allies of the Republican Rutherford Hayes to settle the result of the 1876 presidential election, and it marked the end of the Reconstruction era. Okay? Immediately after the presidential election of 1876, it became clear that the outcome of the race hinged largely on disputed returns from Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. So see, they've been having disputes and all of this kind of stuff about elections and all of this kind of mess for hundreds of years. So some of the stuff that we've seen in recent history, that thing with Al Gore and Bush Jr., all that mess we seen in 2016 with Hillary and Trump and all of this and some of the other ones, that's nothing new in American politics, right? That's nothing new. The only 3 states in the South with Reconstruction era Republican governments still in power, right? So all the other Southern states had Democrats in power. So these were the only 3 states in the South, Reconstruction era states, that still had Republican governments in place. As a bipartisan congressional commission debated over the outcome early in 1877, allies of the Republican Party candidate Rutherford Hayes met in secret with moderate Southern Democrats in order to negotiate acceptance of Hayes's election. The Democrats agreed not to block Hayes's victory on the condition that Republicans withdraw all federal troops from the South, thus consolidating Democratic control over the region. As a result of the so-called Compromise of 1877 or Compromise of 1876, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina became Democratic once again, effectively bringing an end to the Reconstruction era. But let's talk about what that meant for all of these 4+ million black folks who have only been out of slavery for, what, 12 years? Compromise of 1877, the election, the 1876 election. By the 1870s, support was waning for the racially egalitarian policies of Reconstruction. A series of laws put in place after the Civil War to protect the rights of African Americans, especially in the South. Many Southern whites had resorted to intimidation and violence to keep blacks from voting and restore white supremacy in the region. So see, we all these folks running around here talking about there is no white supremacy and what is white supremacy, and white supremacy don't exist. But in all these articles that I'm reading, they name it for what it is, white supremacy, right? Beginning in 1873, a series of Supreme Court decisions limited the scope. Supreme Court decisions limited the scope of Reconstruction era laws and federal support for the so-called Reconstruction Amendments, particularly the 14th and 15th Amendment, which gave African Americans the status of citizenship and the protection of the Constitution, including all-important right to vote. So see, it was the Supreme Court and its decision that was doing the damage to all of these Reconstruction era laws, like the 14th and 15th Amendment, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and 1875, and all of this. See, it was the Civil Court, it was the Supreme Court doing all of this damage. And because there was this constant struggle, and because the more they tried to do, the Supreme Court kept coming in, battering them, beating them, and limiting the scope of this, and saying that this was unconstitutional and this was unconstitutional. Support for the Reconstruction laws and the policies brought about because of Reconstruction was waning. See, it was weighing those white folks out. And you got to remember, those white folks wasn't going to allow themselves to continue to be worn out just to protect what? A bunch of niggas that used to be slaves. Okay? Now you got to remember, because they're not fighting for their own rights. In addition, accusations of corruption within the administration of Ulysses S. Grant and an economic depression had heightened discontent with the Republican Party, which had been in the White House since 1861. As the 1876 presidential election approached, the Democrats chose Governor Samuel B. Tilden of New York as their candidate. New York has always been a Democratic state. And you wonder why the New York Police Department is so racist. And you wonder why you had folks like Rudy Giuliani and Mike Bloomberg and stop and frisk and all of that. Look where the Democrats went to get their candidate. While the Republicans nominated Rutherford B. Hayes, governor of Ohio. Sorry, y'all. In his acceptance of the nomination, Hayes wrote that if elected, he would bring the blessings of the honest and capable local self-government to the South. In other words, restrict federal enforcement of unpopular Reconstruction-era policies. So see, that's what he said he was going to do. Now, he was a Republican now. On Election Day, that November, the Democrats appeared to come out on top, winning the swing states of Connecticut, Indiana, New York, and New Jersey. By midnight, Tilden had 4 of the 185 electoral votes he needed to win and was leading the popular vote by 250,000. The Republicans refused to accept defeat, however, and accused Democratic supporters of intimidating and bribing African American voters to prevent them from voting in 3 southern states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, which they probably did. As of 1876, these were the only remaining states in the South with Republican governments. In South Carolina, the election had been marred by bloodshed on both sides of the party line. Supporters of the Democratic gubernatorial candidate Wade Hampton, a former Confederate general, had used violence and intimidation to confront the African American voting majority. A clash between black militia and armed whites in Hamburg in July ended in the death of 5 militiamen after their surrender, while at Camboy, near Charleston, 6 white men were killed when armed blacks opened fire in a public meeting. With both sides accusing each other of electoral fraud, South Carolina, along with Florida and Louisiana, submitted 2 sets of election returns with different results. Meanwhile, in Oregon, the state's Democratic governor replaced a Republican elector with a Democrat, alleging that the Republican had been ineligible, thus throwing Hayes' victory in that state into question as well. To resolve the dispute, Congress set up an electoral commission in January of 1877, consisting of 5 U.S. representatives, 5 senators, and 5 Supreme Court justices. There we go, them Supreme Court justices. I'm telling you now, the Supreme Court ain't never been your friend. Ain't never been your friend. The commission's members included 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and 1 independent. Justice David Davis. When Davis refused to serve, the moderate Republican Justice Joseph Bradley was chosen to replace him. During the commission's deliberation, Hayes' Republican allies met in secret with moderate Southern Democrats in hopes of convincing them not to block the official counting of votes through filibuster and effectively allow Hayes' election. In February, after a meeting held in Washington's Wormley Hotel, the Democrats agreed to accept a Hayes victory and to respect the civil and political rights of African Americans on the condition that Republicans withdraw all federal troops from the South, thus consolidating Democratic control of the region. Hayes would also have to agree to name a leading Southerner to his cabinet and to support federal aid for the Texas and Pacific Railroad, a planned transcontinental line via a southern route. On March 2nd, the Congressional Commission voted 8-7 along party lines to award all the disputed electoral votes to Hayes, giving him 185 votes to Tilden's 184. So basically, the two devils made a deal. Right? But in this deal, the Democrats promised to respect the civil and political rights of the African Americans on the condition that the Republicans withdraw all federal troops from the South. So see, the Democrats be in line. The Democrats be in line that they would go protect our civil rights and our political rights. Okay? Hayes appointed Tennessee's David Key as Postmaster General, but never followed through on the promised land grant for the Texas in specific. Within 2 months, however, Hayes had ordered federal troops from their posts guarding Louisiana and South Carolina state houses, allowing Democrats to seize control in both those states. As Florida's Supreme Court had earlier declared a Democratic victory in the 1876 gubernatorial election, Democrats have been restored to power all across the South. The Compromise of 1876 effectively ended the Reconstruction era. Southern Democrats promised to protect civil and political rights of Southern Democrats' promises to protect civil and political rights of blacks were not kept. Of course they weren't kept. And the end of federal interference in Southern affairs led to widespread disenfranchisement of black voters. From the late 1870s onward, Southern legislators passed a series of laws requiring the separation of whites from persons of color on public transportation, in schools, parks, restaurant theaters, and other locations, known as the Jim Crow laws, after a popular minstrel act developed in the antebellum years. These segregationist statutes governed life in the South through the middle of the next century, ending only after the hard-won successes of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. That's the reason why it's called the Great Betrayal, because that is when the Republicans went in secret, behind everybody's back, and betrayed Black America. No, the Democrats didn't betray us. Not in that instance. Because in that instance, most black people didn't vote Democrat. Back then, most black people didn't vote Democrat. They voted Republican. They voted Republican. When they held office, they usually held office as Republicans. Now, let me see if I can find that one. There was another one that I had called The Great Betrayal. Now, I'm not going to read too much more because this has been long, but I had to break it down. This is findanyAnswer.com. And the question is, why was the Compromise of 1877 called the Great Betrayal? And this is what this person writes. This is Mohammed Redmond. And this was updated March 25th, 2020. The Compromise of 1877 was an unwritten deal informally arranged among U.S. congressmen that settled the intensely disputed 1876 presidential election. It resulted in the United States federal government pulling the last troops out of the South, formally ending the Reconstruction era. Okay, that's not what I want. I'm not interested in that. Similar Okay, then there's somebody else that asked the question. Tilden as president, the Democrats would have fared as well. To the 4 million former slaves in the South, the Compromise of 1877 was the great betrayal. Republican efforts to assure civil rights for the blacks were totally abandoned. Others emphasize that the Republican Party abandoned the Southern blacks. It asks the question, secondly, was the Compromise of 1877 a good idea? The Compromise of 1877 effectively ended the Reconstruction era. Southern Democrats promised to protect civil and political rights of blacks were not kept. And the end of federal interference in Southern affairs led to widespread disenfranchisement of black voters. So that's the reason why it was called the Great Betrayal. It was called the Great Betrayal because at that point, when they made that deal, all efforts on part of the federal government, because it was run by Republicans, all efforts on the part of the Republicans in the federal government to see to it that the freed slaves, this 4 million plus people, that their civil rights and their political rights would be protected, and that, you know, their citizenship rights would be protected, and all of that just went out the window. All of that was abandoned. And of course, the Democrats lied. You really think that these Southern folk, you know what I'm saying, that were just itching to get their way of life back, and just itching for revenge on these black folks for being so uppity and thinking that you as good as me and that you should be able to have the rights that I have, and you should be able to move around and function as I move and own property and all this and vote and hold public office and all that, and do the same things as a white man in America. How dare you? That's the reason why the new black codes and the new Jim Crow laws and all of that, and the segregation laws and all that, that's the reason why during that Jim Crow era, it was so horrific. And it was slavery without the plantation. That's all it was. Slavery without the plantation. And that's the reason why the lynchings picked up so much during that era. It's because this was the Southern whites' revenge against those former slaves for having the audacity to think that they had the right to demand any kind of civil rights or political rights or any kind of rights whatsoever. So see, that's the history of black folks voting in America. Now you know the rest of the story. How during the civil rights movement they went back to wanting the right to vote and all of this kind of stuff, and the voter registration drives and the freedom riders and the three civil rights workers that were killed down in Mississippi and all of this. You know the rest of the story. And since the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we've had the right to vote again. So we've been voting again for 50, 60 years now, or whatever. Where did white supremacy go? When did we vote out white supremacy? When have we been able to vote on any policies or anything that would get rid of white supremacy? So with all of this and us having this right to vote, what good has the vote done us against our biggest threat? Not just in this country, but our biggest threat globally, which is white supremacy. What good has it done us? Because again, you can't vote away white supremacy. You can't legislate white supremacy. So every 4 years, they put in front of you white supremacy. Every 4 years, you get white supremacy put in front of you. And they tell you to vote for it. And they tell you, well, this white supremacist over here has these policies and has this plan that they want to enact in government and all this. And this white supremacist over here got this one and got that one and all that. But it's still white supremacy. And your vote ain't going to get rid of it. So you keep voting for your enemy. You keep voting for the thing that is killing you, the thing that is oppressing you, the thing that has enslaved you and continues to enslave you. Many black folks are still slaves without the chains and the plantations and the beatings and all. Well, some of them are still getting the beatings by the enforcement arm of white supremacy, law enforcement. So understand, voting ain't gonna do it. If voting could do it, it would be done. Legislation is not gonna do it. Laws are not gonna do it. There are laws on the books. That Civil Rights Act of 1866, it hadn't been repealed and it hadn't been taken off the books. It's still there. Some of those enforcement acts of 1870 and 1871, they still there. The 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, they still there. But you can't legislate away white supremacy. So if voting is not going to get rid of our biggest enemy, and history has shown us that it has not been able to do that, if laws and government policies is not going to get rid of our biggest enemy, which is white supremacy, then why are we voting? Then why are we as black folks, why are we as foundational black Americans, why are we voting? If our vote doesn't have the power to get rid of what harms us, what oppresses us, what targets us, what kills us, what brutalizes us. If our vote can't get rid of it, then why are we voting? If these politicians, with all of their legislation and all of their laws, can't get rid of white supremacy, then what's the point? That's the reason why we got to stop believing this mess and this bull that they keep bringing us about police reform and justice reform and all of that. You can't reform white supremacy. You can't reform anything that was created by white supremacy. You can't reform anything that was created for white supremacy. That's the reason why you cannot reform law enforcement, because law enforcement was created by and for white supremacy. If laws could get rid of white supremacy would be gone. If voting could get rid of white supremacy would have been gone. If voting could get rid of white supremacy, you best well believe the 12 years that black men had the right to vote during that Reconstruction era, the 12 years that they had the right to vote and they had that little bit of protection, and they were holding public office, and they were holding seats in government, and they were holding seats in Congress and all of that. If voting could get rid of it, you can best well believe they'd have got rid of it. White supremacy will never allow black folks globally to have the rights and the privileges the wealth, the power that it holds. White supremacy will never allow that. That's the reason why white supremacy has to go. That's the reason why it totally has to be destroyed. It totally has to be dismantled. There is no such thing as reform. You can vote for change all day and all night, but you cannot vote away white supremacy. You cannot vote away what does black folks in America and globally all the harm, and that's white supremacy. So that's the reason why I decided I'd come on here and give y'all this little lesson number, this little history lesson number 2. So that you can understand that for all these years, when we did have the right to vote, just like we got it now, just like we had to do in Reconstruction, it didn't change anything. And the reason why it didn't change anything is because you can't vote away your enemy. You can't vote away white supremacy. You can even vote into power the people that promise you that they're going to pass laws for this and pass laws for that. But laws and policy won't get rid of white supremacy. Why? Because white supremacy is a system now. White supremacy is a beast that's out of control. And it's global. And it cannot be reformed. It cannot be changed. It cannot be transformed. It can only be destroyed. And your vote ain't going to destroy it. Until white supremacy becomes a crime and everybody who commits it is found guilty of committing that crime and punished for committing that crime. See, that's the reason why the laws of the Reconstruction era didn't work. It's because there was no punishment for anybody. There was no punishment for anybody that was known to be practicing white supremacy. See, there was no punishment. White supremacy was not called out and made a crime. A crime that was punishable by going to prison and in some cases punishable by death. See, when those kind of laws come about, then maybe, just maybe, you can think about getting rid of white supremacy. See, the laws of Reconstruction centered around black folks and protecting them and giving them certain rights and giving them certain citizenship rights and all that, when the laws actually should have been focused on white supremacy. But you got white privilege legislating against white privilege. And white folks ain't going to go off code but so long. So this is the history of black voting in America. Where it started, how it got started, what happened from 1865 to 1877. We know the rest because it picks up with the civil rights movement. And us and folks once again fighting for those civil rights. Not just the right to vote. That was just part of it. But that's what I wanted to bring y'all. And I thought it was important. I thought it was important for us to break that down. I thought it was important for us to break down and for us to see how having the ability to vote, having the right to go to a poll and support this one over that one and all, ain't changing a thing. Ain't doing a thing. Never has. Never has. The Klan was riding high during the time when black folk were being elected to public office more than any other time in history. Especially in that little short space of time, in 12 years. You got folks going from the plantation to 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years later, they hold in public office. And being able to vote in elections. And it didn't change a thing. Didn't change a thing. So y'all make sure you get down there in that description box because there's going to be a lot of links. So make sure you get down there in that description box. You can read these articles for yourself. You can do some of your own research. Look up the Great Betrayal of 1877. Look up the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. Look up these Civil Rights Acts. Look up all of this stuff. Do some reading for yourself. But understand what the black vote has always been about. What the black vote has always represented. And understand that throughout these periods in history when we had it, it didn't change anything. And you notice just like in the 1860s with the rise of black folk getting their, wanting their civil rights and getting these different protections and all of this kind of stuff from the government and all of that, with the rise of them, then all of a sudden, white supremacy rears its ugly head and starts to attack. Well, it was the same way during the civil rights movement. Remember, we just read on the history of the Klan, how after the 1920s, the Klan just seemed to die out again. And then all of a sudden, during the civil rights movement, there was again a resurgence of the Klan. White supremacy raising its head and saying, no, we're not going to let this happen. This is not going to happen. We have the right to vote. Has it stopped black men and women from being killed and brutalized in the street? By race soldiers or by anybody else who's a suspected white supremacist? We have the right to vote. Has it stopped anybody from gentrifying our cities and gentrifying our communities and all of that? But we got the right to vote. We got the right to vote. Has it made our economic situation any better? Do we have any more access to business capital and capital and home loans and all this? Do we have any more access to anything than we had during those periods when we couldn't vote? So that's the history of black vote the black vote in America. So y'all please like this video. Please share this video. Have these conversations. Like I always say, have these conversations on social media, off of social media, with your family, with your friends, with your co-workers, with the people that you hang out with. If you are subscribed to the channel, thank you so much. Y'all know how much I appreciate you, how much I love you. If you're not subscribed to the channel, please subscribe to the channel if you like anything that you heard. Hit that bell notification so you can be notified when we upload videos. But this is the history of the black vote in America. And based on the history of it, and based on what we saw going on then, and what we see going on now, having that so-called right to vote hasn't changed anything for us. Not a thing. So y'all enjoy the history lesson. And I'll talk to y'all later.